My dear students, there should be the rise of income. That means the purchasing power of the people should increase. So if purchasing power of the people increases, it means people can have the ability to buy goods. And if people are buying goods, then that will stimulate the industrial production. And if the industries are producing, then it means more people will be employed in those industries. And if, in fact, more industries and investments will be opened. So for that case, one of the factors leading to economic boom in the United States of America in 1920s, it was the rise of income among the American people, which in fact increases the purchasing power that stimulated the industrial investments and also investments in other areas. And the more the investment, the more the employment, the more people pay taxes and so on. The second point, my dear students, which also led to the economic boom is the First World War, the effect of First World War. First World War had a lot of benefits to the Americans. While other countries were fighting war, the Americans, even though they joined that war late, but in fact they played a role of producers and supplier. They were producing and supplying different goods to those countries which were fighting war. So United States, as a result, she became the supplier of manufactured goods to European countries, because European countries at that time, they were busy engaging in war. So that had benefited the Americans a lot. And by being supplier of goods, then they were able to increase the level of their production. And so the American economy has to grow to a stage of boom. Another point, my dear students, is introduction of tariff against the foreign goods. In 1922, the Congress passed a law that restricted the goods which were imported from other countries. So in fact, that law was called Ford-McCamber tariff. That means it was proposed by a congressman called Ford McCamber. So this is what happened. And from 1922, goods that come from other countries, they were very highly restricted to come to America. And so the Americans, as a result, they were enjoying their internal market as well as exploiting the external market, because other countries didn't have such kind of measure. In fact, we shall come to see they came to adopt the protectionist measure later. But the Americans at that time, in 1922, they were enjoying their market as well as exploiting the foreign market because of these tariffs which has been introduced by the Congress. Another point, my dear students, which led to the rise of American economy to a boom stage, or factor for boom, improvement of transportation infrastructures. There was very high improvement in transportation infrastructures. In 1920s, for instance, Ford Motor Company, they facilitated the motor vehicle production and assembling process. They were producing cars which were very cheap. The car in which almost many families in America could afford to buy those cars. And they reduced the cost of production after they have changed their mode of production in their industry and introduced a kind of system which was called a conveyor belt system of production, whereby each part was to be produced. Assembling was done in some hours. So a lot of cars were produced, and in fact the price of cars was very highly reduced. Not only that, but there were also construction of railways, railways which was cutting across the America and so on. That facilitated the transportation of goods and raw materials from one area to another. And remember, infrastructures, as what has been said by some of the German philosophers, that infrastructures, they're like the vein which are transporting blood in the body, and they're so important in development of any country. So there was improvement of infrastructures in America, which boosted the industrial investment as well as agricultural development in the rural area. Another thing was the cosmopolitans of the American citizens. Of course, we said this in the previous lesson, that the United States is blessed of having people who come from different originality, people who come from different places. For instance, we have the African Americans. African Americans, they are good for something. If you look for, for instance, they are good, as I said earlier, in games, arts and sports and other things. There are some others who are good in shipbuilding. Others are good in electronics. Some others are good financial, like the Jews, as we have said. So United States is blessed of having people who come from different backgrounds. And those people have brought their talents to America. And that talent then helped a lot to the development of United States to what it is today. And so in 1920s, they enjoyed that cosmopolitans of the American citizens. So this is also another very important factor for the economic boom in the US. Another point, my dear students, is the advancement of technological innovations in industrial production. There was technological innovations in America, particularly in that 1920s. Here, for instance, you can see the new process and technology of steel making and refining, for instance, were the foundation of Carnegie and Rockefeller enterprises. The refrigerator, for instance, car, made it possible for the beef to reach the market. That means before the introduction of refrigerator, people could not transport beef or fish from the fishing areas to the market because because they could get rotten. So after the introduction of refrigerator, then people could transport beef, could transport fish from the areas of production to the market and so on. Also, Alexander Graham Bell, of course, this was much more earlier, in 1826, he invented telephone and established telephone company, and for the first time there was the telephone communication between Boston to New York City. This was another very important development. But here is Henry Ford. In 1920s, Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company of Detroit, in 1923, the company was producing 500 cars per day. You can imagine, my dear students, although still took 12 hours and a half to produce each car. But in 1920s, when the assembly line was introduced, it reduced the production time of car from 12.5 hours to 1.5 hours. You can imagine, after every 1.5 hours, a new car is rolling out, ready to go to the market. And this is quite contrary to what has been in 1913, where one new car should be produced after every 12.5 hours. So this was a very high improvement, and it was 1920s. So that's why we say there was advancement of technological innovations and industrial production. This is also another very important reason for boom. Another reason for boom, my dear students, is the rise of American multinational corporations. The rise of American multinational corporations. Multinational corporations are those companies, or corporations, which operate in more than one country. That means some corporations which used to operate in America, they stretched their investment to go to invest in other countries, particularly in Europe and South America, you see. And these people were making a lot of profit. And the profit they were making, it was coming back to America for investment. So this also led to the economic boom in the United States of America in 1920s. Another thing, my dear students, is the rise of GDP and increase of standard of living of the American people. There was the rise of GDP and increase of standard of living of the American people. As we said earlier, standard of living has increased because purchasing power at that time was very high, and GDP also was very high. This has to become one of the reasons for economic boom, because if gross domestic product of a nation is very high, and obvious, it is going to increase the standard of living of the people, and that will lead to economic boom because it's going to boost more production and so on. So this is another factor for economic boom. Let's now look at the impact of economic boom of 1920s. Impact of economic boom of 1920s. What is the impact of economic boom of 1920s? The first impact of economic boom of 1920s is the rise of American multinational corporations. The rise of American multinational corporations. Because of that economic boom, then the American people wanted to go to invest abroad because there was already a lot of investment at home. So they wanted to go to invest abroad. And by going to invest abroad, then it led to the rise of their multinational corporations, which started to go to invest in different parts of the world. That is one. The second impact is the rise of GDP and increase of standard of living of the American people. There was the rise of GDP and increase of standard of living of the American people. Gross domestic product has to increase. It has to increase because we said under economic boom, the level of production is always very high. And the standard of living of the people is going to be also high because of people have got a high purchasing power as long as there is a lot of employment and the people are paid well. My students, let's now look at the negative impact of economic boom in 1920s in the United States. Economic boom, as we said earlier, it's good because there is high production, there is high employment, purchasing power is high, but unfortunately, it has got also some negatives. It has got also some weaknesses. So let's look at the negative impact of that economic boom. The first negative impact of economic boom was the outbreak of Great Depression in 1929, which in fact was caused by overproduction. There was Great Economic Depression which occurred in 1929, and this economic depression was caused by economic boom. Remember, in a capitalist economy, it is always subjected to crisis. Why? Because there is no central planning. There is planning but not central planning. This is contrary to socialist system where there is central planning. People do not plan what to produce, when to produce, how to produce, and how much to produce, and so on. Production is planned by the individual capitalists, and this is leading up to economic depression. So as you can see in this cycle, which is a very normal cycle to a capitalist economy, here there can be production, which is a normal production, but the production can increase to reach a boom stage. At this boom stage, as we have said, the purchasing power of the people is very high, employment is very high, and in fact life is so good at this stage. But because production is increasing without looking at the size of the market, then this is going to lead to what we call economic recession. Economic recession. And this economic recession is sometimes what we call economic crisis. And if care is not taken, if they do not take care at this stage, then it might go down and lead to economic depression. Economic depression. And this is what we are talking now. This is what we are talking about now. And economic depression is a situation where the economy has totally gone down. And some efforts can be done here in a stage that we call economic recovery. Economic recovery. They can try to recover the economy, and of course they will succeed, and the economy will go back to normal, and later to boom, recession, crisis, recovery, normal production, boom, and that is the cycle of any capitalist economy. So for that case, the economic boom of 1920s is what contributed to the economic depression of 1929. And you know how the world was affected by that economic depression. So that is the first negative impact of economic boom. The second negative impact of economic boom is that it led to the increase of income among the wealthier class. That means we are speaking of increase of income of the American people, but the income has increased among the wealthier class, and they leave behind 60% of the American people under a poverty line, who were living, below the poverty line. So you can imagine, my dear students, that 60% of the American people were not benefited by that economic boom. Only 40% of the American people who come from the wealthier class, they were benefited. So again, this is the negative impact of economic boom, because it was not associated with equal distribution of income, at least fair distribution of income, so to say. So this is another negative impact of economic boom. Another negative impact of economic boom is the collapse of older industries, which failed to cope with the new technology. Some older industries, such as coal mine industries, because of the introduction of electricity, some of those industries collapsed because they failed to cope. For instance, we spoke about the Ford Motor Companies improving their production, producing a lot of cars. What does this mean to other industries which could not adopt such technology? It means those industries are going to collapse. So some of the industries collapsed by failing to adopt a new technology of the 1920s. Another negative impact of economic boom is that economic boom led to the creation of new employment vacancies, which resulted to child labor. We said earlier, there were a lot of vacancies. That is a good thing. Women were employed. That was a good thing. But unfortunately, even children were employed. So there were child labor in America because of that economic boom, where the capitalists were they were convincing the children to be employed in their industries because of shortage of labor. And another thing, so my dear students, after looking at economic boom, its impacts and negative impacts, let's now go to another very important part of our discussion of today, and this is the New Deal policy. This is the New Deal policy. What is the New Deal policy? The New Deal policy is the policy which was introduced by the President of the United States, who was elected, of course, in November 1932 and came to office in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt, after defeating the Republican president, Hubert Hoover, then he came to power and introduced a policy which was called the New Deal. New Deal was the policy which was introduced with the aim of recovering United States from the effect of great economic depression. Remember, United States was very badly affected by economic depression. And Roosevelt, during his campaign, he told the American people that if he's elected to become the president of the United States of America, then he's going to solve the problem of economic depression by introducing New Deal. So New Deal was an economic package which was introduced by Roosevelt trying to solve the problem of economic depression. The New Deal, one of its very important things, the New Deal has brought a new kind of capitalist policy, which of course we call it state capitalism. We call it state capitalism. Why state capitalism? Remember, just earlier when I was talking about economic boom, linking it to economic depression, we said that economic boom is always followed by economic depression in a capitalist system because it is not planned, because capitalist system is unplanned. And this, for the first time in the world, United States under Franklin Delano Roosevelt introduced what was called state capitalism, a kind of capitalism which is now planned by the state. That means the state is now interfering, the state is now intervening the capitalist production process, and we are going to see it in detail. And in fact, this this New Deal policy and the state capitalism, it has got a theoretical underpinning from the writing of Adam Smith, one of the very renowned British economists, who used this word state capitalism in his book A Wealth of a Nation. In fact, he said the capitalist system is growing so large, now it will no longer be a self-regulating system. He argued that the state should interfere to help in the regulation of the capitalist system. That is Adam Smith. But Roosevelt, when he was talking about this, a lot of people criticizing him. In fact, they considered, they believed that Roosevelt wanted to introduce socialism, and they condemned him of being a socialist. And Roosevelt, he responded to them by telling his fellow Americans that they should have nothing to fear but fear itself. That if they want to fear, they have to fear the fear itself. And what was that fear itself? It was the economic depression and not the policies that he wanted to introduce, the policy of New Deal. This is what was said by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. My dear students, after having this very short introduction of New Deal policy, let us now look the content of New Deal, the package of New Deal. New Deal, in fact, came to solve some problems. So we are going to look at the problem and the way that problem was solved by New Deal. The first area which was so badly affected by economic depression, it was the industrial sector. The industries in America were producing below capacity because there was no market for what they were producing. But also some industries had already been closed down because there was no market of what they were producing. The price of what they were producing was always going down, And these were the problems that the American people were facing at that time of economic depression. So New Deal was introduced in 1933, as I've said. And the same year, 1933, it came with a law which was called the National Industrial Recovery Act. Under that National Industrial Recovery Act, New Deal has introduced some measures which will be applied to revive the industries. One of the measures which they have applied, it was to ask the industrial producers, the owner of the industries, to reduce production. And so they provided what was called production quotas to each industries. Industries were given a certain amount of goods to produce. Also, they told the industrial owners to put a minimum wage ceiling. That means the state has put a minimum wage ceiling, that the wage of the workers should not be below this amount. And why? Because they knew that one of the problems which caused the industries to collapse, one of the things which caused the economy to collapse, is because of decreasing or purchasing power of the people, which in fact leading up to overproduction. And all these things were introduced. But however, they said this is going to be done voluntarily. And the one who agreed to those terms, then his or her commodities would be given what was called the Blue Eagle logo. And and when it goes to the market, people will buy it because the government, of course, will be telling the people that these are the people who have complied with our terms, so please buy their goods and so on. This is the problem in industrial sector, and this is the way they have tried to solve those problems in industrial sector. They even established what was called the labor relation board, the board which was established to regulate the problems between the workers and the capitalists, the owners of the industries, because these people always, they used to quarrel, and whenever they go to the public courts, to the civil court, it is the workers who were to be defeated in the court. So they have to form a labor relation board which will be there to regulate the problems between the employers and employee. All this, of course, were done to reduce the conflict between the workers and the capitalists. So this is the problem in industrial sector, and that's the way it was solved. There is this problem of labor relations. Also in labor relations, as I've said, they formed a labor relation board, which was then given the power of regulating the problems between the employer and the employee. But also above this, these labor relations, under these labor relations also, they allowed the workers to establish trade unions. And in fact, the workers were given the right to strike and so on when they were demanding for their right. Even though shall come to see also, this one has faced a lot of problems. But this is what they have done. Remember, because of that economic depression, the life of the workers were so difficult. The conflict between the employers and employee were everywhere in America, and in fact it threatened the revolution, because workers started to organize for changes, the changes like what happened in Soviet Union. So because of this, then government had intervened and tried to regulate the relations between the employers and employee. Another problem was the problem of unemployment. Problem of unemployment, remember, my dear students, it has only one solution. Unemployment can be solved by providing of employment, creation of employment. So the government of the United States of America started to think of the way of creating employment. And so they formed different kind of projects where people were employed. For instance, there was public work administration, where people were employed in planting trees, in working in the gardens. They also established the large road construction of dams, like what they, in Tennessee Valley Authority, where they built 32 dams and so on. People were employed and so on. So that is the way they found, that's the way they found of, creation of employment, where people were employed. This is what they did. And of course, some people were employed, even though they did not finish the problem of unemployment, as we are going to see later. Also in the sector of agriculture was very much affected. Agriculture was very much affected. Production had been so highly reduced because the agriculture sector had nowhere to sell. And in fact, if you want to trace the beginning of economic depression in America, you'll see that it started in the agriculture sector, because there was overproduction of raw materials, overproduction of food. For instance, as you can see, in 1925 they had about 8 billion stock of food, but in 1929 that stock of food increased to 16.1 billion. So you can see they used to have a lot of food which has been just kept somewhere, and there was no one to buy. So overproduction in America has started in the agriculture sector, and agriculture sector has suffered a lot. People who have taken loans from the banks and put it in agriculture sector, in fact, they lost everything, and they lost their land because they had put their land as guarantor, and their land has been taken by the banks and so on. So this sector was very much affected. But then under New Deal policy, they introduced what was called AAA. The Agriculture Adjustment Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Under this Agricultural Adjustment Act, some measures were taken to revive agriculture sector. And in fact, farmers in some places, government of the United States have adopted a very strange measures. This include paying the farmers not to produce. That some farmers were paid not to produce. You are given some money not to produce. That if you have your farm, they tell you, don't produce this year and you're going to have this amount. Why are they telling them not to produce? Because the problem, remember we said, it was overproduction. So if there is overproduction, then you'll have to reduce production first and start the production very slowly and steadily, while you are looking at the size of the market. So this is what they did. The government also bought pigs and they slaughter them, distribute them in the learning institutions, and others were dumped in the sea, Why? Because they wanted to create a scarcity, so that when people start the production, then they can find a market and so on. So these are the measures which were taken in agriculture sector. And the aim, remember, it was to revive agriculture sector because it was so much affected by the economic depression. Another sector which was also affected and attended by the New Deal, it was the financial sector. The financial sector was very much affected. My dear students, by 1929, when economic depression started, in 1929, when the economic depression started in the world, United States has lost 10,000, about 10,000 banks. 10,000 banks were closed in America because of economic depression. In this period of 1929 to 1933, about 10,000 banks were closed in America. Why? Because they have run bankrupt. So the American financial sector was very much affected. Even the even the New York Stock Exchange market was affected, and in fact, for the first time ever since it was established, that stock market was closed because people were coming to sell shares while they know that their companies have run bankrupt. So there was what we call a financial panic because of economic depression. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he wanted to end this financial panic, and so he called for, and he asked for money from the Congress, and some banks were given money and they were able to, to come up, and some others were closed forever. In fact, Roosevelt declared what was called a bank holiday, where all banks will be closed for 3 days, and the government, the government people will go through those banks and look at the status of those banks. The banks which are doing good are going to be opened, and the banks which they can be helped and recover, they are going to be helped. But those banks which are in a bad shape will be closed forever. And that's exactly what happened. And Roosevelt, after that, he urged to his fellow American people that please now take your money to the banks, because our banks now are good. Our banks now are functioning. And in fact, people responded, and and the financial sector started to recover. But also in this financial sector, it has gone down to the extent that the people were no longer valuing the US dollar. The US dollar had no value. In fact, people wanted gold. Whenever people are doing some purchases, people would prefer to, have gold than having US dollar, because the value of US dollar was very much fluctuating and it was untrustworthy. So this is what happened, and this is the way the New Deal has played its role. So New Deal solved the problem. In fact, they said they forbid the use of gold if gold is standard. Instead, they say people are going to use US dollar, and whoever had the gold, it must have to be sold to this federal bank. That means the Central Bank of the United States of America. This is the financial sector. My dear students, also there was this introduction of relief fund for the poor people. The poor people were given relief fund. This is the money which is given to the poor people, and they have adopted this system from Britain. Remember, we have discussed in the previous lesson about loan money in Britain, which was given to the poor people. Also in Britain, also in the United States, they came with this system of providing money to poor people. And in fact, the state which could raise $1 US, then the government could give $3 US. That if the state has raised $2 US, then the United States or the federal government is going to provide $6 US. And that is the way of encouraging the states in America to spend money to help the poor people. And this, in fact, has worked, because the poor people, especially the Black Americans, the Black Americans, the Spanish Americans, and so many others who were poor, they were in fact receiving that fund, which of course I say is called a relief fund. My dear students, let's now look at the impact of New Deal. What is the impact of New Deal? The New Deal has several impacts. The first impact is that the problem of unemployment was reduced through the establishment of programs of job creation, as we have said. There is this work administration, civil conservation corps, and so on. So they reduced the problem of unemployment, as you can see. They did not finish that problem, but they reduced the problem of unemployment. Also, there was improvement of industrial production. Industrial production, in fact, was improved. By 1939, the production was was back to normal. That means the production in 1939 had already reached the pre-crisis level. That means it was as good as it was before the economic depression. Also, banks were reopened, as we have said. The people, in fact, restored their trust to the American banks, and the banks were reopened, and the people started to deposit their money into the American banks. That is another very important impact of New Deal. Also, it is strengthening the Democratic Party by conquering the black people as their political base. The black people became the political base and supporters of Democratic Party. Remember, the black people used to support Republican Party, especially due to a role which was played by Abraham Lincoln during the abolition of slave trade and slavery. Remember, it's Abraham Lincoln who issued the decree to abolish the slave trade and slavery, when he said slave trade and slavery should be abolished by the 1st of January 1863. That was Abraham Lincoln. And ever since, the black people then considered themselves as as the supporters of Republican Party until that time of that time of New Deal, where the black people changed and they started to support the Democratic Party and took it as their political base. Why? It's because the one who suffered a lot from that economic depression, they were black people. And by Roosevelt introducing New Deal and introducing that relief fund, the black people, in fact, they were the one who had been very highly benefited by that, because they were suffering a lot due to several other things. Remember, economic depression occurred in America at a time when there was racial segregation. So if there is problem of unemployment, then the black people will be the last to be employed. So it's because of that changes that the black people considered Roosevelt as their savior. So for that case, my dear students, this has to become another very important impact. Another impact is the beginning of state capitalism in the United States of America and the world. Remember, we said earlier, before Roosevelt has introduced the New Deal, there was no such thing as a state capitalism. In fact, no one had ever thought that the state can interfere so much in the day-to-day capitalistic production. But in America, they did. Through New Deal, as we have said, they introduced a system in which the state should have started to tell the capitalists what to produce, when to produce, how to produce. Even the question of how are you going to pay your workers, it has been explained. Even though I've put it very clear, it was not as strict as it was in the socialist country, because they put some conditions, they put some terms, but they left them to be optional. So if you won't do it, you don't do it. But there are some things that you are not going to get if you don't do it. So that's what they have done. My dear students, another impact, of course, was the establishment of relief fund to help the poor. Of course, we have said, and this was established through the Federal Emergence Relief Administration, FERA, and it gave money to the state to help the unemployed and homeless people. About $500 million were spent on providing soup kitchens and clothing and setting up employment and schemes. So you can see this is the money which has been spent to create employment and so on. But importantly, here we have spoken about the establishment of relief fund to help the poor people, the disabled and old people. Another point is the construction of numerous huge projects, including the roads, railways, bridge building, dams. For instance, we are speaking about 32 dams which were built at Tennessee Valley Authority. So you can see this is another very important impact of New Deal. And another impact of New Deal is that New Deal did much to raise the morale and the confidence of the American people. In fact, it raised the morale and the confidence of the American people to fight off any problem when it comes. Because many people thought that the United States is going to collapse because of that economic depression, and especially looking at the way she was affected. But through New Deal, they were able to fight against economic depression, and in fact they went through. So the Americans then believed that if we have managed to fight against economic depression and win, then probably nothing else can come and defeat us. So it rose the American morale and confidence to fight against any problem when it comes. My dear students, what we have seen is just the impact of New Deal, and what we saw is positive impact of New Deal. The New Deal also has got some criticism. It has got some criticism. Some people do not believe that everything that we have said was done by the New Deal. And the argument, of course, is that the New Deal has only reduced, this is the first argument, that the New Deal has only reduced unemployment. But New Deal did not finish unemployment. And in fact, they say it did not end unemployment. The various schemes which had been established, in fact, had a limited impact. For instance, if you establish the project of, let's say, making gardens, for instance, the project of cleaning the roads, planting trees, those were so temporary, and you cannot consider them as employment, because something which has to be done, for 2 or 3 months. Then after that, what else? Nothing else. So you can see, this is what they say. So they put their statistics that unemployment was still 7.7 million in 1937, and it rose to over 10 million 2 years later. So unemployment, of course, was 15 million, but then it was reduced. But until 1937, it was 7.7 people were unemployed in this year, and that number increased to over 10 million 2 years later. That means in 1939. So they say, how can you say New Deal has solved the problem of unemployment? They say, no, you can't say it solved the problem of unemployment. Rather, it only reduced. And they reduced the problem of unemployment through the provision of temporary jobs. This is what they say. The second criticism is about the workers' right. The government has introduced the right of the workers to strike, the right of the workers to form the trade unions. But American employers were deeply resented in this aspect of New Deal, and many large companies hired SAG to beat up the unions, and intimidate the workers who were on strike. During the strike by steel workers in Chicago in 1937, 10 demonstrators were shot dead by the police and 9 wounded. So you can see, people are demonstrating peaceful, but they were shot dead. So they say that even though New Deal has established a system which had intended at maintaining the relations between the employers and employee, but yet it didn't just put some very strict measures and mechanisms of protecting the workers. As you can see, workers were given some right to strike, but whenever they strike, the employers would intervene, and in cooperation with the police and so on. So for that case, they gave the example of what happened in Chicago in 1937. So they say that this is one of the weaknesses of New Deal, that New Deal has done nothing about the right of the workers. But another thing, my dear students, is that New Deal did not go far enough to help the poor American people. The American people are still very poor. For instance, as you can see, Social Security Act, which was introduced during that time of New Deal, has excluded 20% of the workforce in America, including 5 million disparate farm workers. That means 5 million people who were working in the farm, they were not included in Social Security Act. And this, of course, they say is not good. In 1941, the richest 20% were earning 49% of the national income, and the poorest 20% were earning only 4%. That means 20% of the American people were earning only 4%, while 20% of the richest people were earning 49%. So for that case, what they want to say here is the New Deal has just increased the income inequality in America, instead of reducing that income gap between the poor and the rich. Another thing is that the program did little to improve the position of the black Americans. They say that the program had done very little to improve the position of the black people in America. The black people in America were segregated. The black people in America were so poor. They were living in the poor housing and so on. And the New Deal did not go far to improve the life of the black people. In fact, even after the end of the New Deal, the life of the black people was still the same until 1960s and so on and so forth. That they argue that the New Deal has nothing to do with the rise of American economy, but rather Second World War is responsible. For instance, they say rearmament program and American entry to World War, of course, they say is what has played a role to the rise of American economy to what it is today. Let's now move to relations between United States and Japan. My dear students, United States and Japan, they have got their relations started. Of course, they are very long, but during the Second World War, they had a relation which was not good because they fought during the Second World War. And Japan was bombed by the United States after dropping of 2 atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let us look at these relations. First of all, the effect of United States relations with Japan. One, domination of Japan by USA. United States was dominated by Japan from 1945 to 1952, and in fact it was put under the American general who was called General Douglas MacArthur, who was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific, and it was occupied from 1945 to 1952. Also, my dear students, another effect is that United States extended financial and technical aid to Japan. United States gave some financial and technical aid to Japan, which became very useful in reconsolidation and expansion of Japanese economy. Another thing, my dear students, is that the Japanese were forced by the Americans to outlaw their traditional Japanese religion known as Shinto as a state religion, and of course renouncing war and so on. Another thing is the establishment of Japanese parliament, which was called the Diet. The new constitution was called for 2 houses. In fact, they adopted the American style of having 2 houses. They have the lower house and the upper house. And this was put in the constitution, which was written by the Americans, San Francisco, by Douglas MacArthur, and then imposed it to the Japanese for use. Another effect, my dear students, that Japan was used by the United States as a ladder to the American foreign policy, in the Far East, to prevent the spread of communism. Another thing, my dear students, is the emergence of Japan as one of the leading industrialized states and the American greatest economic rival. In fact, now Japan is one of the is American greatest economic rival. Of course, before the emergence of China, it was that way. And Japan is one among the G8 countries, or the most industrialized state, and the third richest country in the world after the United States and China. So you can see Japan emerges one of the leading largest economy in the world. Also, another effect of that relation is the introduction of land reform, where whereby the head of this CAP, General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur ordered the tenants to sell their land they once owned, and so there was abolition of feudalism, and Japan became fully capitalist country because of their relations with Japan and occupations. Another thing is the expansion of the United States imperialism in Asian countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Philippines, and so on. Another thing, my dear students, we have now come to the end of our lesson. Let us now break and we'll be back for the question. My dear students, you remember at the beginning of our lesson, I gave you some questions, and it is my hope that now you have gone through those questions, and while we were continuing with our lesson, and now you can be able to provide the answers to those questions. The first question was, show how the First World War accelerated the 1920s economic boom. Here we are talking of economic boom in relation to First World War, my dear students. But remember, one of the things that you can see, the economic boom occurred in America, and that was 1920s. And in fact, later it was followed by economic depression. So how do we relate the economic boom in America with the effect of First World War? First, of course, we have said, and we have said the way United States of America was benefited by First World War. In fact, she was enjoying the market in Europe, and they were producing a lot. So because of that First World War, United States of America was able to to grow her economy and become one of the largest economy in the world. So that's the way you can link the First World War with economic boom. So you can say simply there was a large availability of raw materials because other countries were not producing. So the Americans were enjoying a large supply of raw materials. For instance, iron, zinc, agricultural raw materials. And second, there was large market to those countries because those other countries were not producing. So United States had concentrated in production. Remember I said they joined that war late compared to other countries. But also, First World War has benefited the United States. Why? Because a lot of people from different countries after the war, they went to America either to look for job or to look for the green pastures, the good life. And some of them, we said already, they went to America with their talents. And their talents then were used for the American economic boom and so on. So my dear students, this, of course, to get some other points, this is what you can say regarding this question. Another question, my dear students, is the United States New Deal policy was never a deal. Substantiate. Of course, the New Deal policy was never a deal. That means the New Deal policy has not worked. So we'll have to look to those points given by the people who criticize the New Deal. People who say that New Deal has done nothing to help to recover the American economy, but other things did. So the point, of course, that you can give is the New Deal did not solve the problem of the black people in America. The black people in America were suffering before the New Deal, and they still continue to suffer even after New Deal. So it solves the problems of giving people the so-called relief fund, but they did not address the problem which was facing the black people in America. The black people continue to suffer. There was problems of the black people in America such that they had no right to vote and be voted, and that problem was not solved at all. Also, it did not solve the problem of unemployment, but we said it only reduced the problem of unemployment, and that problem was reduced through the provision of some temporary jobs, the jobs which in fact were to end for quite a short time. That is also another way in which one can say the New Deal was not a deal, was never a deal. Again, economic recovery was enhanced by other factors, but not New Deal. Some people argue that economic recovery in America, it was made possible by the impact of Second World War. When Second World War broke out, other countries were not concentrating in production. The Americans were putting their concentration in production, and they produced a lot and supplied those goods to other, to those countries and so on. So they say that New Deal has nothing to do with the recovery of the American economy, but Second World War had a connection to the recovery of the American economy. Another thing which they say is that it did not address the problem of income inequality. Problem of income inequality was not addressed, as we have seen. Majority of the American people, they were still poor, while the 20% richest American people, they were enjoying about the highest percentage of GDP. Also, it did not guarantee the workers' right. The workers' right was not guaranteed, even though they gave workers the right to establish union, the right to strike, but there was no any mechanism which has been established to make sure that it is implemented. This is another question. The third question is, show the impact of US aid to Japanese economy after Second World War. My dear students, as you can see, the first impact is the rise of Japanese economy, as we have said. The spread of Cold War, especially during that Cold War politics. Emergence of trade war between USA and Japan. Even though USA has helped Japan to become one of the largest economies in the world, but after Japan, the Japanese have become highly developed in economy, they started to wage a trade war between USA and Japan. Even though now that trade war has been calmed down after the emergence of China, now of course we see China and Japan, China and the United States of America being in the trade war. Establishment of military relations between USA and Japan, even if when you read the Japanese constitution, that the defense of Japan, it is in the hands of the Americans. And the Americans had their forces at Okinawa for quite a long time. They used to have their forces at Okinawa in Japan. And finally, introduction of democratic system in Japan. The democratic system which is operating in Japan with two houses, the lower house and the upper house, where they have the emperor and the prime minister. That system, in fact, it was architected by the Americans. As I said earlier, the constitution which is used in Japan today, it was written by General Douglas MacArthur. And so you can see the way the Americans have shaped the Japanese politics and so on. So my dear students, together with some other points, this is what you can provide.